difficult story to share, as it involves my uncle's evil legacy, which was brought to a head many years ago. I never met him, but when I was a teenager, my mother told me that he'd committed suicide, and that was that. My father, who was his brother, died from cancer when I was only 3, and there was no other living relatives. Dad was the only one in my uncle's will, which left his house of horrors that was then passed over to my mother. Uncle Arthur's house of horrors was called as such due to the horrifying murders he conducted before his death. He knew that the police were closing in when many young women went missing over a period of 15 years. After his death, the subsequent investigations and clean-up, Mum finally decided what to do with the property. By the time I was 21, there was a total refurbishment, and then she rented it out to several people. When I reached 30 years of age, I took over the dealings and had to answer many complaints about the building. The renters said they heard screams and saw ghastly apparitions. I never believed ghost stories and was a little annoyed with having to check the property at all times of the night. At this stage, Mum was quite ill herself, so I often went to the building alone, armed with a flashlight and my pistol. One night at the beginning of autumn, I received yet another call from a new tenant who said she heard screams. Tired of the complaints, I felt that they were just knee-jerk reactions to the rumours and stories about the murders. I'd refused the suggestion to bring a priest or a medium in to perform a cleansing, so I went in to investigate myself. This time I decided to spend more time in the building, especially in the basement, where no one liked to go. I told the woman to stay somewhere else for the night, so I could check the premises out without any hindrance. Beginning with the second floor, I methodically swept through each room and did my best to keep my eyes peeled. I also kept my ears open and did hear many sounds, all of which I assumed could be easily explained using reason. When I heard the occasional moan, I attributed it to the plumbing and the shifting of the old framework. At times I felt a blast of cold wind and assumed that I needed to get the drafts and air conditioning checked. When I went to the first floor, I heard noises which sounded like screams, but I thought they were cats fighting. As I got to the top of the stairs, which led down to the basement, I heard a distinct guttural growl from below. I have to admit, it did freak me out a little, but I convinced myself that it was probably creaking pipes, or even the door. Switching the lights on, I noticed a strong odour of blood hitting my nostrils, but passed it off as rusty metals. When I walked down the stairs, I heard shuffling footsteps, which made me wonder if squatters were there. I called out angrily, "Who's down there?" But no one answered, so I kept moving to the bottom of the stairs. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up when a blood-curdling scream came from the far end of the basement. I turned my flashlight on, due to the fact that the light didn't illuminate the whole area, but couldn't see anything. What made my flesh crawl was the growing sound of weeping and pleas for help. I couldn't explain them away. I kept yelling, "Who's there? occasional screams. Then I sensed a dark presence behind me, growling and chuckling. I spun around and nearly fainted when I saw that the basement was cluttered and filthy, like I was in another house. The screams were louder now as the lights flickered and the growling presence loomed large in the background. I walked past a large wall of boxes and crates to see a scene that might as well have been straight from a horror film. 3 young women were hanging from hooks in the ceiling, secured by their wrists and naked, dripping with blood. 2 of them seemed to be either dead or unconscious, while a younger blonde woman kicked and screamed. Her blood-soaked gag had dropped to her neck, and I saw several deep cuts in her chest and abdomen, still bleeding. Shaking uncontrollably, I blinked many times, trying to convince myself that I was dreaming, but it was all too real. Then I saw a scene behind the row of hanging women, where a long steel table was being prepared by a big man. I didn't realize that I was still creeping towards the table, as the man fiddled with shackles at each of the corners. He wore a black raincoat with a hood over his head, muttering and chuckling as he pulled out a hammer. I suddenly bumped into the table in shock, then screamed as he turned to face me. It was my Uncle Arthur. He gave me a vicious smile that soon morphed into a scowl as he cackled loudly like a maniac and pointed to me. He yelled, "On the table now, little piggy." I turned to run, but smacked into one of the hanging women. I felt the blood sticking to my face as I continued to scream, while my uncle's strong hands grabbed my shoulders. In a split second, he dragged me back and slammed me onto the table, then quickly shackled my ankles and wrists. He wrenched the flashlight from my hand and smashed it down on my forehead. I saw stars for quite a while. I felt blood trickle into my eye as many screams filled my ears, along with the howling coming from my uncle. It was like he thought he was an animal howling at the moon, while he slammed the hammer all along the table. I felt the table shake as he continued to bring the hammer down between my legs and the other parts of the table. I couldn't believe it when I started to scream and plead, "Uncle Arthur, it's me. Please don't hurt me." He was muttering again, saying incoherent things as he rummaged through the drawers of his workbench. He turned around with a saw in his hand, looking at me in a dazed and furious way. I thought I was going to die. There seemed to be 100 women screaming now as he brought the saw down, roughly onto my neck. I could see his black-rimmed eyes as he leered at me, dribbling through rotten, gnashing teeth, growling like a beast. When the saw started tearing at my flesh, I screamed for the last time and passed out, with blood and tears mingling. It seemed like an eon before I woke up, flat on my back on the floor of the basement, which was now back to normal. I sat up and wondered if it was all a dream, but nothing stopped me from convincing Mum to sell the property. That was the first story. By the way, all of these stories are taken from the same website, and apparently they are all true. The second story is called Evil Shadows Over a Dark Christmas. Most people think of Christmas as the epitome of family holidays, wholesome, magical, and shielded from anything nefarious. myself for the sake of preserving the happy image of a wonderful day for those who love Christmas. As a child, I already had my work cut out for me with parents who were far from normal. My father hated Christmas, and he refused to observe the day, which meant that I had to keep my mouth shut if I didn't want to incur his wrath. Mum was always about. Mum was always out of it due to her issues with substance abuse. Dad also had issues, handed down from his father. Mum said that he was born with a bottle of beer in his hands, and at Christmas time the situation always worsened. It was like he had a secret vendetta for the holidays, and he did everything he could to make sure our house was Christmas free. When I was 10, things took a bizarre and evil turn for the worse. Some nasty friends of my parents turned up, and they all decided to conduct a séance. I hid myself away in the bedroom while they all got wasted and tried to summon demons to act as sentries against Santa, and to invoke Satan instead. I fell asleep and didn't wake up until around 3 a.m. Seeing as the house was silent, I crept downstairs to check out the carnage. My parents and their guests were spread throughout the living room, passed out and draped over each other. It was disgusting, but I was distracted by a creepy noise. It sounded like old creaky gears grinding against each other, and it seemed to be coming from the fireplace. The child inside me grew hopeful and excited, but something told me that I might want to run. When a dark creature started to clamber out of the fireplace, my flesh began to crawl. The sound started turning into a mix of crackling skin and old bones being crushed. The creature looked like it had been incinerated to a crisp, but it remained intact as it continued to creep around the room, stepping gingerly over the bodies, like it was trying to decide which one to choose from. I saw the charcoal hands and long fingers reach for my mother's hair. I gasped loudly, and it suddenly looked up. I'll never forget the eyes, like tiny fires in large, burnt-out sockets. It opened its unholy mouth wide and screeched with a dry, crackling voice. I screamed when more creatures scrambled out of the fireplace. Running to my room in a blind panic, I could hear the demonic entities racing up the stairs behind me. When I got to my room and spun around to close the door, I saw at least 6 of those ghastly monsters only inches away. As I slammed the door shut, several of their charred fingers were chopped off. I screamed again when the fingers started growing into smaller versions of the black creatures. I jumped under the covers and cried while the demons tried to drag the sheets off me. Imagine my surprise when I saw my parents grabbing at me with a frightened look in their eyes. Maybe I imagined it all, but it was bizarre how everything changed from that day forward. My parents cleaned up their act, and the following year we started to observe the holidays, including Christmas. Mind you, I always kept an eye on the fireplace, in case those demons decide to return and drag my family to hell. That was the second story. The third story is called Something's Wrong with My Son. It seems so pointless and ungrateful for me to even complain about what most people would say is nuts, but I have a theory that my 15-year-old son isn't my son. I'm not saying that I think he was either switched at birth or that my wife cheated on me back then, but he and I don't click at all. Don't get me wrong, he looks like me, sounds like me, and even acts like me at times, especially when he's angry or finds something amusing. People are always praising my wife and I for raising such a perfect, well-mannered, intelligent, and good-looking boy who cares about the world and all creatures great and small. If you ask me, he's a little too perfect. Even when he loses his temper, he's thoughtful and soon apologizes. Some would say that we have a perfect life. We're well off and we live in a beautiful home which is taken care of by my wonderful wife. Some say we're so lucky that it hurts, but I'd give anything to have what other people have, even if it meant to being poorer. I enjoy seeing the trials and tribulations of others. That's what life is supposed to be all about. But my wife doesn't agree. She loves how perfect her little angel is and goes on and on about how wonderful he is. It makes me want to vomit and scream. The only time she ever lost her temper was 6 months ago, when I told her about a vivid dream I had. It started with my son being a year old again. I went into his room and saw the window open with the curtains flying and flapping about. I went over to close the window when I felt the hairs on my neck prickle. I slowly turned around and saw an evil-looking shadow person leaning over the crib. My instincts kicked in and I raced over to the crib, but the creature grabbed my son up and leapt out of the window. I yelled for my wife as I ran down the stairs to apprehend the creature, as my son screamed in terror. When I made it outside, she came up behind me with our son on her hip. Both were smiling sweetly at me. After that dream, I woke up crying and saying that I finally knew what happened to our son, that we'd been left with a changeling from the other side. My wife was so enraged, she slapped me across the face. She was so hurt that she began to cry. I comforted her and tried to shake off the dream. I'll never forget the next morning at breakfast, when my son gave me the strangest smile. He said, "I love you, Father. You know that, right?" I gulped and nearly choked on my coffee because I was so chilled by the undertone of his trained voice. "Yeah, I know that, Daniel. I love you too." I watched as he stared right through me with his pale green eyes before he looked back at his eggs with a satisfied smile. Just yesterday we went to a crazy New Age festival which my wife loves to attend. She and Daniel put on crazy hats and danced with the other nuts while I sipped some god-awful herbal smoothie. I nearly choked when I saw a boy watching me from the other side of the field. Something about his eyes and the wistful way he looked at me pulled at my heartstrings. I started to move towards him, but in an instant he was gone. I could have sworn I saw a dark figure leading him away. I was then distracted by Daniel, who gave me an almost threatening look. "Father, aren't you going to join in?" he asked in a menacing tone. When I saw the pained look in my wife's eyes, I gave in and took his hand. "Sure," I smiled. I keep telling myself, someday soon. Alright, the next story is called Secrets Between Two Sisters. I've always been afraid of my little sister. Jackie is 2 years younger, and she's always been an introvert, but she sees things. Even now at 17, she is still tied to Mum's apron strings, never leaves the house, and still sees things. Everyone thinks she's special. She's always told crazy stories, and when we were younger, she sometimes got me in trouble by telling our parents the most bizarre things about what she saw. She lied a lot. I was always innocent, and she had to try and drag me into it. Dad told me one day that she told him about an evil spirit in her room. Jackie would come down for breakfast in the morning with scratches on her back and face. She'd murmur to herself, and we could hear things like, "Nasty demon." Mum was upset and took her to the doctors, who said that she was doing it to herself and was showing signs of schizophrenia. One time, Dad found bird beaks that were still dripping in blood, scattered and left in strange places around the house. They were stuffed under cushions, inside coffee cups, and poking out of the air vents. We followed the trail of tiny feathers and drops of blood all the way back to Jackie's room. He went nuts that day. I remember hearing Mum and Dad fight over what to do about Jackie. They sat her down and asked her about the beaks. She shook her head violently, chirping like a bird and screeching until they got the medicine down her throat. We were all so terrified of her. I kept my door locked at all times. When I started having nightmares and passing out every time something happened, Jackie was always standing there, staring at me with her pale green eyes. Her messy orange hair always creeped me out, but when she took the scissors to it and did a freaky hack job, I wondered if I would be next. Mum was worried that I was going insane too, but when I turned 18, I decided to move out with my boyfriend. I'll never forget the last day when I was packing my bags and boxes. Jackie sidled up to me and handed me an envelope. She giggled and backed away as I opened it. I froze. There were pictures she'd drawn of me scratching her face and torturing animals. I looked up in confusion and saw her pointing at me with an evil grin. "You're the one, Denise. You're the demon. You come to me at night in your sleep." I didn't want to believe it, even though I did have problems with sleepwalking when I was little. She whispered in my ear as I fought back the tears in disgust. "Keep bringing me the baby birds, Denise. I like the crunch. If you don't, I'll tell, and you'll be taken away." I tried to keep her happy, but now my boyfriend wakes up with scratches all over him. I think that one was my favourite one. The next one is called "My Friend Was Possessed." This event happened a couple of years ago during spring break at college. My two friends and I decided to go on a 3-day rafting trip near Fresno. I had been on these rivers before and I love them. They're easy to navigate and for the most part are pretty calm. The weather was going to be just right for the weekend, sunny and warm temperatures. The first day, everything went pretty smoothly. The rivers were calm as we paddled down them. The scenery during the day is amazing, and the night was clear and cool. When it started getting dark, we stopped to make camp for the night. After dinner and a couple of drinks, we each went into our own tents to pass out. I love camping, but the one thing that annoys me to this day is trying to fall asleep in the woods. There are all sorts of sounds like bugs, birds, and flowing water. It takes me forever to fall asleep when I camp. very low humming sound. It was like a subwoofer that was cranked up to 10. It was so loud that the ground underneath my tent started to vibrate. It was very brief and only lasted a few seconds. When it was done, there were no longer any sounds of bugs, birds, or anything else. The whole forest was silent. I walked out of my tent and saw in the moonlight what I can only describe as a shadow figure standing by our campsite. The mysterious thing had no clothes, no skin, and no facial features. He was enwrapped in darkness. He turned towards me and then looked towards my friend's tent and vanished inside. At first, I thought I was just imagining things, but then I started to hear shouts and noises coming from inside the tent. Fearing something terrible had happened to him, I quickly ran over to my friend's tent and went inside. My friend was violently shouting, but it appeared he was still asleep. He wasn't saying anything that I could understand, just a lot of gibberish at a very fast speed. He started thrashing in his sleep back and forth and started to shout louder. I went over to him and tried waking him up. I called his name, but he couldn't seem to hear me. I started shaking him, which didn't seem to do anything as he was already lashing out. Desperately, I looked around for something to snap him out of this trance. To the left was his water bottle. In a panic, I pulled off the top and dumped it on my buddy's face. He let out a blood-curdling scream, and from under the sleeping bag, I thought I saw a dark mass exit and crawl under the tent. I asked my friend if he was okay and if he could remember anything that happened. He said that he was having a horrible nightmare, where he was wandering through the forest, surrounded by fire and demons. He told me it felt like he was in hell. I kept my friend company for the rest of the night, and in the morning we told our third friend what had happened, and he agreed we should cut our trip short. I've never witnessed something as terrifying as that night. I'm glad I was awake when whatever possessed my friend did, because if I hadn't, I don't know what would have happened to him. The next story is The Day I Became Afraid of Water. I am aware that the title of my story seems a little over the top. However, you'll soon see why I chose it. It seems like a lifetime ago, when I was an 8-year-old, and like many other children, I hated having to stop playing in order to take a bath. It meant that bedtime was looming, but I had no idea that it would lead to one of these true ghost stories, which I was too young to even read at the time. Being a senior now, it's amazing how that memory is one of the strongest among the many in my aging mind. My parents were loving but strict, so I wasn't allowed to take toys into the bath. I had limited time to wash myself properly and prepare for bed, but the one thing I enjoyed was pretending that I was a mermaid. It was the only way to make a dreary task palatable, so I would wash quickly and spend the rest of the time slithering about and singing like a siren, albeit quietly to myself. One night changed that forever, when I felt like I wasn't the only one in the bathtub. For the record, I wasn't ill, I wasn't sleepy, and I'm sure it wasn't my childish imagination. After I hurriedly washed myself, I slipped under the water and started my mermaid game, pretending that I was in a magical water world. Then I saw what looked like some kind of a face grinning in a sinister way on the side of the bathtub. I gasped and leaped out of the water, sitting back on my knees and spluttering, trying to catch my breath so I could scream. Even though the face disappeared, I knew I wasn't was no way that it was just a reflection of my own face. It was surreal and dark, sending waves of fear through my psyche. But I just had to try and figure out what or who it was. I know it sounds strange, but I was suddenly self-conscious about being naked, so I covered my lower body with the washcloth before sliding back onto the surface. No sooner had I done so when I saw the face again, this time on the bottom of the tub, looking back up at me. The evil face had a terrifying look to it, like it wanted to hurt me. What happened next still haunts me, which is why I haven't taken a bath since, or stepped in a puddle or any body of water. As I pulled back in order to get to the surface, something either pulled me down or compelled me to get closer to it. It felt like my face and the face of the ghost or whatever it was were like magnets mashing together. I bumped my forehead as I thrashed around, trying to get away from it and feeling like I was being sucked down the drain. The funny thing about it was, I must have dislodged the plug as the water was now draining fast. I screamed as the gurgling water dragged my hair along with it, still battling to rise up and away from the face, which was now distorted and swirling along with my hair and the water. Then I felt two large hands under my armpits and dragging me up. I fought hard as I screeched in terror, not realizing that it was my father. He brought me up into his arms as I kicked and cried. He yelled, "What are you doing, silly child?" I stopped and then clung to him like a drowned monkey. I pointed to the bath, but the face was nowhere to be seen. When I told him what happened, he laughed and dried me off. From that day forward, I refused to take a bath or swim. I only took showers, which pleased my parents, but I have to admit, I take the fastest showers in history. Even though I know that there's a good chance it was just my imagination, I'll never forget that awful face and how it made me fear for my life.